Hey everybody, it's Tom, and anyway, pardon my earbuds, gotta get the mic on. So today I'm coming to you to talk about some more philosophy of mind stuff. To recap what we've been doing in the last few videos, we started with a recapitulation of the question of mind to brain, or perhaps more specifically consciousness to brain reduction. Whether we are, or whether our consciousness is, simply the outcome of so many physical chemical processes. In the course of that recapitulation, we arrived at the notion that really in vogue approach to conciliating the tension between the mental and the physical, which is a distinction we inherit perhaps most immediately from Descartes, though it will have adumbration. There's stuff going on before Descartes, but he's a convenient point of departure that we can accept for the purpose of this conversation. But an approach to conciliating the relationship between those terms is the invoking of a particular logical relationship known as that of supervenience. Supervenience is a relationship which you could say holds between two sets of facts or two sets of properties or what have you, A and B, such that A will supervene on B if there will be no change in the A facts without some sort of change in the B facts. Now, it's important to know that this relationship is not one of causality. It's sort of a mode of correlation. And what it permits is, at least as a point of stipulation, the assertion that the mental is intimately connected with the physical world in a way that is not to be discounted. Now, the issue arises whether that is a point of assertion and synthesis, if you like, or is it just a kind of a logical fact? And then you see you have various argumentations, such as those offered probably most famously by David Chalmers, but he's not the only one who does this, which point in the direction of saying that, look, there is in fact no logical necessitation here that would translate into consciousness having, as a matter of mathematical or logical certitude, a dependency on the physical. There may be a quote-unquote natural connection, a kind of natural supervenience this is how things just happen to work in this universe, as opposed to in some other universes. Well, this is significant, because if the relationship between consciousness and the physical or material world is a merely natural as opposed to logically necessitated one, then you are drawn into all sorts of thorny questions. Now, so we talked about that, and we talked about, in terms of like one area where these thorny questions arise, the issue of mental causation, or mental to physical causation, and we sort of recapped Jaegwon Kim's analysis of those problematics vis-a-vis an article he had on that point. He also talks about it in his seminal Philosophy of Mind, which is, even though it's an introductory book to philosophy of mind, it also serves as a survey of those issues, which is yet suitable for the expert. Anyway, so much by way of preface. What I wanted to discuss today is the famous Chinese room argument put forth by John Searle in a book of his. Well, let me just go ahead and turn to that. It's actually, it was in a chapter within the book. The chapter Can Computers Think? And the book in which that chapter was contained, Mind, Brain, and Science, a 1984 text. But the chapter is Can Computers Think? And it's all over the place. It's easily found. I'll put links below in the description. So, one of the approaches that is sort of subordinate to the supervenience, or in tandem with the supervenience approach, to the issue of whether we can construe the mind as a function of the physical processes that constitute the brain, is the idea that the brain itself can be understood as a kind of computation device, a computer. Now, we can define a computer, as John Searle does in his article, or in the chapter, as a device which achieves results through symbolic manipulation. This is a very broad definition, but it works. It's suitable if you think about what's actually happening with something like a computer, a calculator, even an abacus. The sort of the classical abstract description of a computer or a computing machine is probably what's known as the Turing machine, where what you have is an input-output system which leads to the alteration of the machine's state. So the way you set it up is you can imagine a kind of ribbon, and then there's a reader, okay, and put the reader at a particular point on the ribbon, which is correlated with the symbol, and the symbol is then registered as a direction one way or the other for the reader to stay there, or to advance a space, or to go back a space, or what have you. Despite the simplicity of this schema, it can very easily be translated into a kind of sketch of the fundamental logic and even very remarkably complicated computing systems. And as it all goes, we say, well, maybe the brain is just like that. And insofar as the brain is just like that, well, then you are tempted to believe that you are approaching something like a reduction. However, what is missing out of the piece is the act of interpretation. In other words, it's not enough simply to manipulate symbols to arrive at results. Even ones and zeros, the symbols which we associate with the computer, don't even strictly stand for numbers. They're just directions to alter the state of the computer, if you like. But their meaning is empty. They're sort of what you could term empty signifiers. There's no content there. And the term which Searle's used and which is apt is that it's an utterly syntactical framework. There's no meaning. There's no semantic aspect which correlates necessarily with that syntax. This is intimately related to the distinction between a sentence exhibiting something like logical validity as opposed to actual truth. You can have a formally cogent assertion without that assertion actually reflecting reality. I just point that out as an example of how syntax and semantics can diverge very easily. And what's going on with the mind is very much a semantic affair. Yes, the mind is involved in a sensitivity to syntax and how various syntactical formations can indicate different meanings, but those meanings ultimately are the outcome of interpretation which arises really out of a social matrix that is not amenable to containment within merely syntactical or relational terms. there's something being added over and above the syntax in the phenomenon of consciousness, which is structurally distinct and apart from the syntax. And it is in virtue of this circumstance that you really can't reduce the mind to the brain, unless you want to re-understand the brain, which you can do. And at that point, it occurs to me as I say that I'm sort of diverging from Searle there, because Searle is sort of more sensitive to, or more willing to put forth that the mind and the brain are, well, not quite identical, but sort of more intimately linked than I might perhaps put it. What he does is he says that the brain exhibits biological processing, and it is this unique biological processing that the phenomenon of semantic consciousness and engagement arises. And this is distinct from what happens with artifacts, where it's only a syntactical processing which is occurrent. And I think this is kind of sort of pushing the question of whence semantics arises into another sphere, because biology is still sort of amenable itself to a more or less mechanical construal. And if biology is amenable to a biological construal, then apparently semantic processes would be likewise understandable in that vein. However, if you go ahead and commit yourself to that notion, then you fall into a contradiction, because a merely mechanical understanding at the end of the day is really a merely semantic or formal understanding, which drops the issue of content or meaning out of the analysis, and thus puts you outside of an actual engagement of the question of consciousness and meaning and semantics. Well, all that, by the way, all that stuff, meaning, semantics, and all the rest of it, can be placed under the umbrella of the notion of intentionality. Now, here we're not using intentionality as it's employed in common English usage. What we mean when we say that consciousness is intentional is that there is always an aboutness to it. Consciousness is never simply blank. It's always engaged in a relationship with some object. You see something, you hear something, you're thinking about something. Whatever is occurring within the space of consciousness is embracing something like an object. And thus it's ineluctable, it's intrinsic, it's signature intentionality. Now, the interrogation of intentionality is something which gets some treatment in the analytic tradition, but is taken, I think it's fair to say this, up with greater breadth and gusto along a different line that is more often seen as an exponent of the continental tradition. What is the analytic versus the continental tradition? Well, very briefly, toward the end of the 19th century, those of us who might be called quote-unquote professional thinkers, as Kant sort of put it a bit sardonically, sort of diverged into what has been known as the analytic and the continental camp, with the analytic taking their cues from people like Frege, and a little later on Russell Wittgenstein really wants to clear up issues of epistemology and knowing, saying, look, until we get this stuff worked out, how we know, what we know, and so forth, we can't really proceed to other questions which we have typically seen as those which are distinctively philosophical, What is the meaning of life? What is truth? What is God? What is freedom? Etc., etc., etc. In fact, many people within the analytic tradition go so far as to say those questions actually often are meaningless and reflect simply a bad or imprecise use of language. Not everybody, but there's a large portion or swath of that tradition which is sympathetic with that analysis. And that's tied up with logical positivism and some other stuff. The continental tradition is alive to those questions, but is not as wedded to the idea that you can only begin to speak significantly upon certain issues after you have set up a certain resolute position regarding matters of epistemology and so forth. They sort of, and the continental tradition takes its cue more from people like Nietzsche, and then later on is associated with existentialism, and in the vicinity of existentialism, phenomenology. Phenomenology, whose sort of great-grandfather was Brentano, but then really gets going with Edmund Husserl, is that branch which really takes the idea that what sets consciousness apart is its intentionality seriously. And to wit, in future videos I'm going to return to this notion and look at how Brentano and Husserl and other people talk about this and work with this notion of intentionality and its ramifications for consciousness. And in turn, how does this relate back to what John Searle is talking about in his article, Can Computers Think?, where he sets out, he's like, look, the problem with the assertion that computers can think, except maybe in a trivial use of the word think, or to the verb to think, is that it forgets all this intentionality stuff, all this meaning stuff. And he shows this by the Chinese room argument. What is the Chinese room argument? And I'll just go ahead and recap that to close this out. We'll finally come to the Chinese room, where the Chinese room is a little room in which you can sit, and you have an instruction book, and people will sort of direct certain symbols and send it into you don't see them, they just send the sort of symbols under the door to you, and you look at those symbols, and then you look at consult your instruction book, and your instruction book says, well, if you get symbol A, then you put out symbol B, and so forth. And see, the symbols are Chinese characters, and the instruction book is what Chinese characters should you put out in response to whatever Chinese characters you have put in. And you yourself don't know a word of Chinese. But because of the manner in which the instruction booklet is composed, the person who gives you the messages in Chinese and then receives whatever you put out, you'll not be able to know that you don't know Chinese, because the mechanism of symbolic manipulation gives the appearance that you do. You're actually putting out, in response to their input, perfectly coherent responses. But also, so that what that indicates is this divide between semantics and syntax, which finds reflection in that you can appear to know something while not actually knowing something. Similarly, a computer can appear to think without actually thinking. And this distinction between, let us say, simulation and duplication, as Searle puts it in his writing, is absolutely crucial when it comes to the question of who and what we are, and how are we going to relate with computers and technology. Because, as I've mentioned in other videos, not so much in the philosophy of mind videos, but other stuff I've done, we increasingly hear language around machines and technology which personifies them and which apotheosizes them or lionizes them or puts them up on a pedestal, which demeans the human. We can even talk in the metaphors we use for computer programming, like the idea of neural networks and all the rest of it, right? This is a projection of metaphor which obscures the crucial distinction between an active subjectivity as what is the real ground of an individual and a person, an ethically meaningful being, and machines, which are simply rearranging symbols, albeit in a remarkably sophisticated fashion. They can abet very noble projects. But in the process, we're giving away our power as human beings. And we are inverting the significance of means and ends. So this is, in my view, an incredibly important issue, both with respect to technology, but also as far as like the topic of whether we're just our brain, whether we're just, to use Searle's term, meat machines. Okay, this is very significant to me. I would think to you as well, because if that's all we are, if we're just machines, then what is the basis of ethical and moral commitment? What is the basis of freedom as a real category? Now, some of you and some people want to challenge the notion that freedom itself is significant, and we can have that discussion. But I just want to say that one's position, I think, on whether the mind is reducible to historically physical terms is intimately connected with the issue of freedom in a complicated way, in a way that may never sort of open up into like a real crisp resolution. But it is an important matter. So much for that for today. That's my reflection for today. I'll put the links below to Mr. Searle's piece, which is a very lucidly composed, very accessible piece. An enjoyable read. I would exhort you to check it out, and I hope my remarks upon it have been of some avail. Anyway, this has been Tom, and I'll catch you guys on the flip. Bye.